She drove 4 hours through a Montana snowstorm with 12 paintings in the back of her car and $200 in her bank account. She set up a folding table at a winter market, stood in 28-degree cold from 7 in the morning, and watched every single person walk past, every single one. Then a quiet cowboy in a worn Stetson stopped. He did not say much. He just looked at her paintings the way people look at things that matter. Then he put $500 on the table and said, "I will take them all." That was not charity. That was one human being recognizing another at the exact moment she had stopped recognizing herself. What happened next changed both of them in ways neither one expected. This channel is home to stories of the American West, where love is earned through honest work, where compassion shows up in muddy boots and calloused hands, and where the most powerful human moments happen not in grand gestures, but in the small, true things people do for each other when no one is watching. This story will remind you that being truly seen by another person is one of the rarest and most healing gifts life can offer. And it will remind you that it is never too late to walk back toward the life you were meant to live. If this kind of story speaks to something in you, stay with us. Hit subscribe so you never miss another one. Leave a comment and tell us what moved you. And if you know someone who needs to hear a story like this today, share it with them. That is how good stories find the people who need them most.
The cold came early that November. Not the soft, polite cold of late October, when you could still pretend summer had only stepped out for a moment and would be right back. This was Montana cold, the kind that settled into the ground and decided to stay. The kind that made your fingers clumsy inside your gloves and turned your breath into small white clouds that disappeared before you could think of anything to say. Ellie Marsh had been standing behind her folding table since 7 in the morning. It was now past 10. The Bozeman Farmers Market was winding down for the season. A few dozen vendors stretched along the covered walkway, selling the last of their autumn squash, their handmade jams, their wool scarves, and beeswax candles. Christmas music played from a speaker somewhere down the row, tinny and distant, like a memory of a warmer place. Snow had started coming down about an hour ago, light and steady, the kind of snow that looks pretty from inside a warm house. From outside a warm house, it was simply cold. Ellie had covered her folding table with a length of old blue velvet, the same cloth she used to use for student art, shows back at Jefferson High School in Denver. 12 oil paintings stood in a row on the table, leaned carefully against the small wooden ledges she had built herself from scrap pine. The paintings ranged in size from 8 by 10 inches up to 16 by 20. She had made the frames herself, too, cutting and staining the wood in the parking lot of her apartment complex across 3 weekends in October, because she could not afford to have them professionally framed. Every painting showed a piece of Montana. A ridge at first light, the sky going from black to deep purple to the palest possible orange. A river running through a canyon in early fall, the cottonwoods still holding their yellow leaves. A ranch road in fog, 2 fence lines disappearing into the gray. A barn door left open on a winter morning. A rectangle of warm orange light spilling out onto white snow. She had painted them all on location. She drove out, set up her easel, and sat in the cold or the wind or whatever the day gave her. And she painted until she understood the light, until she felt she had been honest. On the back of each painting, she had written 2 or 3 sentences in her careful handwriting, not an artist's statement, just the truth of the moment. Things like, the light only lasts 11 minutes before it changes, And you have to decide if you are painting what you saw or what you wanted to see. Or, I sat here for 2 hours before I understood what made this place feel like it does. A man I loved once said that open land never judges you. I think he was right. She had also made a small sign and propped it at the front of the table. $45 each. Every painting tells a true story. The bottom corner of the sign was getting wet from the snow that blew sideways under the market canopy. The ink was starting to bleed at the edges. 2 hours and 45 minutes since she had arrived and set everything up. Paintings sold. 0. People stopped. Of course they stopped. The paintings were good, and she knew they were good. She was not someone who confused confidence with arrogance, and she was not falsely modest either. She had spent 16 years teaching young people to look at the world honestly, and she knew what honest painting looked like. These paintings were honest. Customers would stop, look, nod slowly, sometimes lean in close to read the writing on the back of whichever piece they had picked up. They said things like beautiful and remarkable, and I love this one. Then they set it back down and moved on. The woman selling sourdough bread at the next table, a cheerful woman named Ruth, who had gray hair and flour permanently worked into the skin of her hands, leaned over around 9:30 and asked if Ellie wanted some coffee from the thermos she had brought. Ellie said, "Thank you. I am great." She was not great. The night before, at 11:30, her phone had received an email from Mountain West Medical Collections. The subject line read, "Final notice." The body of the email was short and professional and completely devastating. $34,200. Legal action begins December 1st, 17 days from now. Ellie had read the email 3 times. Then she had set her phone face down on the kitchen counter of the motel room she had rented for $39 a night, gone into the bathroom, run cold water over her wrists until her hands stopped shaking, come back out and made herself a cup of instant coffee from the little packet on the desk. She had driven 4 hours north from Denver the day before because someone in an online forum for independent artists had mentioned that the late-season Bozeman market drew generous buyers, people who had moved up from cities and appreciated real landscape work. She had packed the 12 paintings, which represented 4 months of early mornings and cold afternoons and 1 full tank of gas for every location shoot, and she had come north because this was the plan she had. It was the only plan she had. Her checking account held $203. She had applied to 14 teaching positions in the 3 months since Jefferson High had eliminated the arts department. 11 schools had sent rejection emails. 3 had not written back. She was 47 years old. Her husband had been dead for 3 years. Her back hurt from standing. The snow was getting a little heavier. She straightened the smallest painting on the left end of the row, though it did not need straightening because her hands needed something to do. That was when he stopped. She noticed him the way you notice someone whose stopping has a different quality than the polite stopping of someone who is just being kind. He did not slow down and glance over. He stopped entirely, the way a man stops when something in the world catches something inside him, and there is a moment of recognition, before either side knows what to do about it. He was tall, a brown Stetson hat, the kind that had been worn long enough to lose its showroom shape and become simply itself, a dark flannel shirt under a canvas work jacket, jeans with actual wear in the knees, boots with dried mud on the lower quarter. He crouched down to look at the smallest painting at eye level. He picked it up. He turned it over and read the back. Ellie watched him. She watched the way his eyes moved across the words she had written, not skimming, actually reading. He set it down and picked up the next one. Ellie spoke. Her voice came out, professional and steady, which was something she was very good at. She said, $45 each. 3 for 120. He did not look up right away, he said. You paint these from photos or on location? It was not the question she was expecting. Nobody asked that, she said. On location, I drive out, set up my easel, and I sit there until I understand the light. He stood up then and looked at her directly for the first time. He had gray in the stubble on his jaw and lines at the corners of his eyes that had been made by years of squinting against outdoor light. His eyes were a dark, calm brown, the color of creek water under shade trees in summer. He looked at her the way people look at things they are trying to understand, rather than things they are trying to purchase. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and took out his wallet. He set a $500 bill on the blue velvet. He said, I will take all of them. Ellie went very still. She said, all of them? All 12. His voice was level. Not apologetic, not performative, just honest. He said, I know that is not what they are actually worth, but it is all the cash I have on me today, and I did not want you standing here in the cold for another 3 hours. That last sentence moved through her, the way cold air moves through a room when someone opens an outside door. She could not have explained precisely why. He did not know her. He did not know anything about her. And yet, the sentence was the truest thing anyone had said to her in a very long time. She took the money. Her hand was not quite steady. $500 solved less than 2% of her problem, and she was aware of that mathematics in the back of her mind. But she took it and said thank you, and began folding the blue velvet. He said, my ranch needs an art instructor. She stopped folding. He said, I have a son who has not come out of his room in 5 months. His doctor says he needs something to do with his hands, something other than physical therapy. Ellie looked at him. She said, you do not know anything about me, he said. I know you have been standing here since before sunrise in 28 degrees, and you had not sold a single painting before I walked up. And I know you paint like someone who understands what it feels like to lose something real. She stood there in the snow with the $500 bill in her coat pocket and a folded length of blue velvet in her hands and a decision in front of her that was no decision at all, which is the most complicated kind. His name was Wade Calloway. He owned 1,200 acres southeast of town. He was, she would discover, a man of very few words, nearly all of them true. She said, all right, I will come and see it. He gave her the address and said he would be there by 2 o'clock, and she could follow him out if she wanted. She watched him walk away through the market in the light, snow, his hands in his jacket pockets, unhurried, back straight. He stopped at the vendor, 3 stalls down, bought something, and kept walking. The woman from the sourdough table leaned over again. She said, who was that? Ellie said, I am not entirely sure. She finished folding the velvet. She put her folding table under her arm. She walked back toward her car through the snow, carrying 12 empty spaces where 12 paintings had been, and the faint, strange feeling that something had just shifted in the world without making any sound at all. She followed his truck for 40 minutes. Out of town on Route 86, then south on a 2-lane road that ran alongside the Gallatin River, then east on a dirt road, she would not have known was there if she had not been following someone who knew exactly where they were going. The mountains were ahead of her the whole drive, the Bridger Range running north to south, already white above the tree line. The ranch came into view around a bend past a long row of ponderosa pines. It was not what the movies would have you imagine. No whitewashed split-rail fence running along a photogenic lane. No red barn placed just so against a perfect sky. Callaway Ranch looked like what it was, a working property that had been here a long time and intended to be here longer. The main house was timber-framed, 2 stories, painted a dark rust red that had faded unevenly over the years so that it looked like the color of dried autumn leaves. There were 3 separate outbuildings, a large workshop, a calving barn that could hold 40 head at least, corrals made of thick pine poles, and a series of smaller structures she could not identify from the drive-in. Behind all of it, the land opened up and ran flat toward the mountains. She could see the cattle in the far distance, small black shapes against the white and brown of the November pasture. Wade parked his truck in the yard and got out without ceremony. She pulled up beside him and got out too, he said. "Come on in." The kitchen was large and warm and smelled of coffee and something with onions that had been cooked earlier in the day. A wood-burning stove sat in the corner of the living room, which was open to the kitchen, and it was putting out a steady, serious heat that the rest of the house seemed organized around. A young man sat at the kitchen table. He was 24 or so, with his father's build but a different quality of stillness. Where Wade's stillness felt chosen, this young man's stillness felt like something imposed on him from outside. He had dark hair that needed cutting and a left arm in a fiberglass cast from wrist to elbow. He looked up when Ellie came in, and his eyes moved over her face with no readable expression. Wade said, "Cole, this is Eleanor Marsh. She is a painter from Denver. She might be staying a while." Cole said, "All right, that was all," he said. A woman came in from the back hallway, wiping her hands on a dish towel. She was perhaps 68 or so, broad through the shoulders, with short white hair and the kind of face that had made peace with most things. She looked at Ellie in the way that experienced people look at new things, steadily, without rushing toward any conclusion. Wade said, "This is Ruth Halston. She keeps this place from falling into chaos." Ruth said, "That is a full-time job." She nodded at Ellie. "You want coffee?" Ellie said, "Yes, please." They sat at the kitchen table, the 4 of them, and Wade laid out the arrangement in the plain way that was apparently just how he talked. $800 a week, room and board included. 6 days of instruction for Cole, starting whenever she was ready. A 4-week trial period, $800 a week, 4 weeks. $3,200. She was doing the math while he was still talking. $3,200 plus the $500 from this morning was $3,700. She owed $34,200 plus the legal fees that would accrue if this to court plus next month's rent. On the Denver apartment, she had not yet told her landlord she was vacating. She was not even close. She was not remotely close. But standing outside in the parking lot of the Bozeman Farmers Market an hour ago, she had been even further from close, and the difference between those 2 positions was significant. She said, "I have a few conditions." Wade said, "Let's hear them." She said, 2 hours in the afternoon are mine. Every day. I need time to work on my own pieces. That is not negotiable. It is a functioning requirement the same way a working ranch hand needs adequate sleep. She said, "Nobody touches my supplies without asking." And she said, I will teach Cole the way I know how to teach. If you are going to second-guess my methods every day, this will not work for either of us. Wade said nothing for 3 seconds. Then he said, that is fair. Cole was looking at her from across the table. His expression had shifted slightly. Not warmth exactly. More like something that had been completely closed, had moved a fraction of an inch. Ruth brought the coffee. She set it down in front of Ellie, and then stood at the counter and looked out the window at the yard in the way of someone who has learned that the best thing to do with certain conversations is to simply let them happen. Ellie said, I will need to drive back to Denver and get the rest of my things. If we are doing this, I will be here by Friday. Wade said, Friday is fine. She drove back to the motel in Bozeman that afternoon through the darkening snow. She sat on the edge of the bed for a long time without turning the light on. The room had a window that faced west, and the last of the light came through it, pale and flat. She picked up her phone. The lock screen was still a photograph of Daniel. He was laughing in it. They were at a gallery in Chicago, the Sotheby's Autumn Preview, and someone had said something that struck him as genuinely funny, and she had caught his face in the middle of the laugh, eyes crinkled, mouth open, completely unguarded. He was 49 in that photo. He would be 53 now if he were here to be anything. She looked at his face for a moment. Then she opened her contacts and called her landlord and told him she would be out of the apartment by the end of the month. When she hung up, Ruth's voice from the afternoon came back to her for no particular reason. Ruth had walked her to her car when she left and said, on the porch, quiet enough that it was not quite directed at anyone. It is always the ones who say they are just going to look that end up staying. Ellie had thought that was about her. Now she was not entirely sure. She turned on the bedside lamp. She took out her sketchbook and a pencil, and she drew the view from the kitchen window of the ranch. The barn, the fence posts, the mountains behind everything. The particular way the late afternoon light came across the pasture in long, flat lines. She drew it from memory because she had looked at it carefully when she was there. She had always looked carefully at everything. Daniel used to say that was her actual gift, not the painting itself, but the looking. Anyone can learn to paint. Very few people actually learn to see, she thought. 4 weeks. 4 weeks, $3,200, and whatever she could manage to sell through the gallery contact she had been avoiding for 3 years, she thought. Daniel would say, you are not going to that ranch because you have no choice. You are going because it is the right place to be right now. He would say that with total certainty, the way he said most things, and she would argue back, and he would listen to her arguments patiently, and then say, I know, Ellie. I know, and he would still be certain. She closed the sketchbook. She turned off the light. Outside, the snow kept coming down over Bozeman, over the farmer's market with its empty vendor stalls, over the dirt roads running out to the ranches south of town, over the mountains that stood in the dark, watching everything in the particular way that mountains do. Without judgment, without urgency, without any opinion about whether any of it would work out. She arrived on Friday with everything she owned in the back of the Civic. 2 suitcases of clothes, a cardboard box of books, a large rolling case that held her canvases and stretchers, and the wooden storage box she had built herself to hold her paints and brushes and mediums. Everything fitted into foam cutouts she had shaped precisely to each item. A second box held her easel, broken down into its components, and a folding camp stool. Wade met her in the yard and showed her to her room without much ceremony. It was on the second floor of the main house, at the end of the hall past the bathroom. The room had a window that faced east toward the mountains. The bed had a log frame. There was a desk and a chair and a small dresser. The closet had hooks instead of a rod, the kind of practical decision that made perfect sense in a house where people did not stand at their closets trying to decide what to wear. She put her things away and came downstairs. Wade said, "Cole knows you are here. Whether he comes out today is his call." Ellie said, "Understood." She made herself useful in the kitchen until Ruth shooed her away, then put on her coat and gloves and went outside to look at the light. The morning sun was coming in from the southeast and hitting the barn at an angle that laid long shadows across the snow. She spent 20 minutes just standing and looking, which she had always found to be the necessary first step before any painting. You had to look until the place stopped being scenery and started being real. The next morning, she knocked on Cole's door at 8 o'clock. She knocked once. Silence. She knocked a second time. Still nothing. She did not knock a third time. She had told Wade she would not, and she kept her word. But more than that, she understood something about the silence on the other side of that door. It was not the silence of someone who was not there. It was the silence of someone who very much was there and very much did not want to have to explain themselves to a stranger. She had lived inside that silence for 2 years after Daniel died. She recognized it. She went downstairs, got her supply case and her easel, and set up in the yard directly below Cole's window. She assembled everything methodically, mixed a small amount of paint on her palette, and began working on a view of the barn door in the morning light. She did not announce herself. She did not look up at his window. She simply worked. The sound of the bristles on the canvas was the only sound besides the wind. She did this again the next morning, and the morning after that. On the fourth morning, Wade needed help on the east fence line. Hector Vargas, the foreman, a compact New Mexico-born man of 50, who had worked this land for 22 years, had come down with a serious cold. 3 miles of fence needed. Checking after an ice event had stressed several posts, and Wade did not want to wait. He asked Ellie at breakfast if she could drive the truck. She said, sure. This was not entirely accurate. She had driven pickup trucks before. She had never driven one on an ice-hardened dirt road in the dark through a Montana November morning. But the answer was sure, because there was no productive alternative answer, and because she had spent her entire adult life doing things she was not entirely certain she could do until she was doing them. They left before first light. Wade drove out to the fence line, and then she took the wheel while he walked sections of the fence, and she drove slowly alongside him, the truck crawling over the frozen ground. They talked the way people talk when they are working alongside each other, and there is no particular need to perform a conversation. Fragments, things said, and then not followed up on. Long silences between that did not feel empty. He told her about his father building this fence the summer Wade was 12. 6 weeks, just the two of them, working from the east boundary to the creek crossing. Wade said he had been furious about it at first, because his father had promised they could spend part of that summer visiting his aunt in Billings, and instead they spent it digging post holes and stringing wire. He said, by the time we finished, I did not care about Billings at all. She asked why. He was quiet a moment. Then he said, because we had made something that would outlast both of us. And I was 12 years old, And I understood that, not in words, just in the feeling of looking back at the fence from the truck on the drive home. Ellie said nothing. She kept her eyes on the road. After a moment, he said, "I have not told that story to anyone in a while." She said, "It is a good story." He nodded once and went back to checking the fence. And she drove along beside him in the thin November light. And they did not say much for the next 2 hours. But the silence between them had changed in some way that neither of them noted aloud. On the seventh day, Cole opened his door. He did not come out all the way. He stood in the doorway at the top of the stairs and watched Ellie come in from outside with her supply case. She did not look up immediately. She set the case down, unzipped the top, and took out a medium brush to clean, she said, without looking up. "Is your right arm working all right?" Cole said. "More or less," she said. "I'm going to put chair out in the yard tomorrow morning. If you want to sit outside while I work, that is fine. You do not have to do anything," he said. "I am not going to paint," she said. "You do not have to." He stood there another moment. Then he went back into his room and closed the door. The next morning, when she sat up in the yard, he came outside. He did not paint. He sat in the chair she had put out, and he watched. He had his right hand in the pocket of his jacket and his left arm in its cast, resting across his knee. He did not speak. She painted for 90 minutes. When she finally set down her brush and started cleaning up, she turned the canvas so he could see it. He looked at it for a long time. He said, "Why did you make the sky that color?" she said. "Because that was the actual color of the sky at 8:14 this morning," he said. "It does not look real," she said. "I know. Real things often do not look real when you try to show them to someone. That is the whole problem with painting." He did not say anything to that. But the next morning he came out with a pencil in his right hand and sat down, and after 40 minutes he made a mark on the sketchbook page she had quietly set on the arm of his chair. It was a small mark, a short horizontal line, then another. He did not say anything about it. She did not comment on it. She just kept painting. That was how it started. By the end of the second week, he was filling full pages, slow and tentative at first, then with more decisiveness. He drew what he saw around him: the fence posts, the water tank, the shape of the mountains on the south side. One afternoon, he drew the kitchen table with the coffee cups on it, a rough and slightly lopsided rendering, and showed it to Ellie without explanation. She looked at it carefully. She said, "This is a good drawing," he said. "It does not look right," she said. "It looks exactly right. It looks the way you actually see that table, not the way a photograph would show it, the way it lives in your memory and your perception. That is harder to do than you realize." He looked at the drawing again with slightly different eyes. Ruth came to stand in the kitchen doorway and watched them from behind, and the expression on her face was the particular expression of someone watching something they had hoped for but had not been sure they would get to see. 3 nights into the second week, Ellie could not sleep. She came downstairs at midnight and saw the light under the office door. She stopped in the hallway for a moment. She could hear nothing, just the low hum of the heat and the occasional pop from the wood stove cooling in the living room. She went into the kitchen. She made 2 cups of coffee. She opened the office door quietly and set 1 cup on the desk beside Wade without speaking. He had papers spread in front of him, columns of numbers, and the tension in his jaw was the particular tension of a man who has been looking at the same numbers long enough that they have stopped meaning anything. He looked up at the coffee. He did not say thank you. He just looked at it for a moment and then picked it up. She went back to bed. In the morning, neither of them mentioned it. But something between them had been established in that small exchange, something that did not need a name. She called the collections attorney on Friday of the second week from her room. Her voice was steady throughout. When she hung up, she sat looking at the wall. 2 weeks of pay, plus the $500 from the market, $2,900. She owed $34,200, plus growing legal fees. December 1st, 10 days away. She went downstairs and looked out the window. Wade was on horseback in the late afternoon light, moving along the fence line in the south pasture, and the orange light was hitting him and the horse and the snow in a way that had no right to be that beautiful. She got her paints. It was in the third week that the small dailiness of things began to carry more weight, not the dramatic weight of decisions or confessions, the weight of small, unremarkable things done carefully, the weight of a cup of coffee placed on a desk at midnight, the weight of a book left on a table with no note, the weight of a chair set out in a yard before the person who will sit in it has said they are coming. Ellie found a section of wooden fence rail down one morning, knocked over by ice accumulated along the top. She did not know if Wade had noticed it. She found posts and wire and a hammer in the supply shed, asked Hector where the right-sized nails were kept, and spent an hour fixing the fence herself. She had never fixed a fence in her life. The repair was not elegant. It was functional. When Wade came back from the afternoon pasture check and saw it, he stopped his horse and looked at it for a moment. He did not say anything. That evening, Ellie came back to her room and found a book on her desk. It was thick and well made, a library of reproductions, Montana landscape painting, masters of the big sky country. No note, no name inside the cover. She sat on the edge of her bed and opened it and read for an hour. She thought, this is how he talks. Cole had been coming outside every morning now, without being asked. He had moved from pencil sketches to actual paint, starting with watercolor, because she had given him a small pan set and told him it was more forgiving than oil while you were learning basic observation. He painted slowly with his right hand, the left arm still in its cast propped on his knee. The first morning he used the watercolors, he painted the view of the Bridger Range from the yard. The mountains were entirely the wrong color, a sort of enthusiastic blue that had nothing to do with the actual hue of the granite and snow. Ellie looked at it and said, "This is a good start," she said. "Tell me what color you actually see when you look at the mountains right now." Cole looked up. He squinted. He said, "Kind of gray. Brownish gray at the bottom. Blue-white higher up," she said. "Paint that." He looked at her. She said, "Forget what the mountain is supposed to look like. Paint the color you just described." He mixed the colors with a careful uncertainty. The result was much less vivid, much more strange, and much more true. He said, "It looks worse." She said, "No, it looks real, which is harder than looking pretty." He stared at the painting. Something moved across his face. Not quite a smile, not a smile. One afternoon in the third week, Cole brought a photograph to the yard session. It was a small photo, bent at one corner, the kind taken on an actual camera before everything moved to phones. A woman in her early 40s, laughing at something off camera, standing in front of a house Ellie did not recognize. She was pretty, in the way of someone who does not particularly think about it. Cole set the photo on the arm of his chair and looked at it for a while. Then he opened his sketchbook and started drawing. Ellie kept her eyes on her own canvas. She did not comment. She did not ask who the woman was, though she had a good idea. She just worked alongside him and let him do what he was doing. By the end of the session, he had a rough pencil portrait. The proportions were slightly off, and the perspective was uncertain. But the quality of attention in it was unmistakable. He had drawn the woman the way you draw someone when you are trying to hold on to them. When he stood up to go inside, he left the sketch on his chair. He did not take it with him. He did not ask Ellie to look at it. She looked at it for a long time after he had gone. Then she carefully picked it up and set it just inside the door where it would not be damaged by the weather. On a Thursday evening, at the end of the third week, Ruth went to spend 3 nights with her daughter in Livingston. Ellie made dinner, a basic pasta from things she found in the pantry. Cole ate quietly. Wade came in late after an emergency with one of the heifers in the north pasture, washed his hands at the kitchen sink, sat down, and ate without speaking. The 3 of them finished the meal in near complete silence. But it was a different kind of silence than the silence of the first week. The first week, the silence had been the silence of strangers in a waiting room. This silence was the silent people who had been in the same place, long enough that they no longer needed to fill it. After Cole went upstairs and the dishes were done, Wade sat down at the kitchen table with the last of the coffee. Ellie sat across from him with a glass of water. Through the window, the yard was dark and the sky had cleared, and the stars over the bridge range were unreasonable in their number and brightness. Wade said, "You have a show or something coming up?" He nodded in the direction of her supply case. She said, "Not currently. I have a contact at a gallery in Bozeman." "I have not been in touch with her in a while." He said, "How long is a while?" She said, 3 years. He looked at her. She looked at her glass of water. She said, "It is complicated. She was a friend of my husband's. After he died, I stopped being in touch with people from that part of our life." Wade nodded. He said, "My father died 6 years ago. After that, I stopped returning calls from people he knew in Seattle. I told myself it was because I was busy." Ellie said, "That sounds familiar." Wade said, "Took me about 18 months to realize it was not about being busy." Ellie said, "Took me about 2 years to realize that, and I still have not done anything about it." He said, "Maybe you should." She said, "Maybe." She went to bed thinking about Patricia Holt, about the gallery on Mendenhall Street with its big north-facing windows, and the way it smelled of plaster and old wood and linseed oil. About the last time she had been there, 8 months before Daniel died, and how Patricia had looked at a small piece Ellie had done on a whim and said, "This is the real thing, you know. This is what the real thing looks like." Daniel had been standing beside her when Patricia said that. He had squeezed Ellie's hand once, just briefly, the way he did when he wanted her to pay attention. She had looked at the painting and not quite believed it. 3 years later, lying in a log frame bed on a Montana ranch with the stars outside her window, doing their best work, she thought, "I should have believed it." The threat came from 2 directions at once, which is usually how the serious ones arrive. The first came through her phone on a Tuesday morning. She was in the yard with Cole, both of them working, when she felt the vibration in her pocket and excused herself to step around the corner of the workshop. The name on the screen was Richard Stowe, the attorney from Mountain West Medical Collections. His voice was flat and professional, the voice of a man who made 30 calls like this one every week. He said, "Miss Marsh." We have become aware that you have been engaged in commercial sales activities in Bozeman, Montana, in recent weeks. Specifically, a sale of artwork at the Bozeman Farmers Market. If you have income that has not been disclosed in the current collections proceedings, that creates additional legal exposure. She said, "How do you know about that?" He said, "Someone photographed the market and posted it online. You were visible in the photograph, along with your work." She said, "I made $500. He said, "That is not the point. The point is disclosure. The legal action date is December 1st. That is in 9 days. I strongly advise you to contact our office before that date." He hung up. She stood on the cold side of the workshop in the thin morning sun and held the phone down at her side and breathed. In and out. In and out. The particular thing about Richard Stowe was that he was not wrong about any of it. He was doing his job. The system he worked inside was functioning exactly as designed. The fact that she had spent 2 years watching her husband die and had taken on debt to give him every possible chance, the fact that she had lost her job and had $200 in her account and was trying to keep herself alive by selling paintings in a winter market, none of that was relevant to the system. The system did not have a mechanism for context. She thought about this for a moment without any particular anger. Then she went back around the corner to where Cole was working. He looked up at her face. He did not ask. He just looked at her for a moment and then looked back at his painting. She picked up her brush. They worked in silence until noon. The second thread arrived that afternoon in a Range Rover. Grant Pallister was a substantial man in his late 50s, the kind of man who stood in every room as though confirming his own presence. He wore a jacket that Ellie recognized as the kind that cost what a month of Hector's wages cost. He arrived without calling ahead, which was either confidence or bad manners, probably both. Wade was in the yard when Pallister pulled in. Ellie was coming from the workshop with a clean brush in her hand. Pallister looked at Ellie for a moment before speaking to Wade. He said, "New wife?" Wade said, "Employee." Pallister smiled in the way of someone who has heard this kind of answer before and finds it mildly amusing. He turned to Wade. He said, "I am making the same offer I made since September. $2,800,000 for the west section, 400 acres. You keep everything east of the creek," Wade said. "My answer has not changed," Pallister said. "I know it has not. I am asking you to reconsider." He paused. He looked at the paintings visible through the open workshop door. He said, "Beautiful work." He glanced back at Wade. "But beautiful work does not cover a banknote. I believe your next major payment is in March?" Wade said nothing. Pallister said, "I am a patient man. I just want to make sure you know the offer stands." He nodded at Ellie, pleasant and entirely unbothered. He got back in the Range Rover and drove away. Wade watched the truck till it was past the pines. Then he stood in the yard very still. Ellie said, "Is he right?" "About March." Wade did not answer for a long moment. Then he said, "The spring beef numbers need to come in above projection. There is some room for error." "Not a lot," Ellie said. "Are you going to lose the ranch?" he said. "Not if I can help it." He walked toward the barn. She watched him go. That evening, after Cole was in bed, Ellie sat at the kitchen table, and Cole's laptop was open in front of her where he had left it after dinner. She almost closed it. Then she stopped. The search bar was empty. She typed the name, Patricia Holt Bridger, Mountain Arts, Bozeman, Montana. The gallery's website came up first. The exhibitions page showed the current show, a series of large-format photographs of glacier recession. clean and serious work. Then she clicked over to the About page and read the short biography. Patricia had expanded the gallery 3 years ago, had added a consignment program for Montana-based artists, had developed a mailing list of 340 private collectors, regional and national. Ellie sat with this for a while. Then Cole came back downstairs for a glass of water, which he did sometimes when he could not sleep. He saw her at the laptop. He said, "I was doing some reading earlier." He sat down across from her. He turned the laptop toward himself and navigated to a page she had not found. It was an archived article from Denver Art Weekly, dated 2019. Headline, Eleanor Marsh, The Invisible, Eye Behind Denver's Most Significant Private Collections. He pushed the laptop back to her. She looked at the article. It had her name in the headline. There was a small photograph of her at a viewing at the Denver Art Museum, standing beside Daniel, both of them looking at a large abstract canvas. The article discussed, over about 800 words, the way certain collectors quietly rely on advisors who are never publicly credited. It named 3 significant acquisitions at Denver auctions that had, according to sources, been driven by her recommendation. She said, "That was Daniel's world." Cole said, "Your name is in the headline." She closed the laptop. He said, "I am not trying to push. I just thought you should know it was there." She said, "I know it is there. I knew the article was published." "I did not want to think about it." He said, "Why?" She said, "Because everything in that article is about who I was when Daniel was alive. Reading it feels like reading about someone else, someone I am not sure I still know how to be." Cole was quiet for a moment. Then, he said, "I know something about that. Feeling like the person you were before something happened is someone you do not quite have access to anymore." She looked at him. He looked at the table. He said, "Good night," and got up and went back upstairs. She sat alone in the kitchen for a long time. The stove ticked as it cooled. Outside, the November wind moved through the pine trees in a sound like low, steady water. She picked up her phone and found Patricia's number. She had never deleted it. She typed out a message. "Pat, it has been too long. I know that. I have new work. 12 Montana landscapes, all painted on location. I am in Bozeman for a while. Would you be willing to look at them?" She pressed send before she could think about it too much. Then she put the phone face down on the table and sat with the particular feeling of having done something that cannot be undone, which is sometimes the best feeling available. Patricia texted back at 7 the next morning. "I have been waiting 3 years for this message. Yes, call me today." They talked for 55 minutes. Patricia's voice was the same, quick and precise and warm underneath the precision, like a fire that keeps good temperature. She did not spend more than 30 seconds on the fact that Ellie had been out of contact for 3 years, she said. "We can talk about that over coffee. Tell me about the work." Ellie described the 12 paintings. She described the locations, the light conditions, the quality she had been chasing in each one. She described the text on the back of each piece. Patricia was quiet for a moment after Ellie finished. Then she said, "Ellie, real Montana landscapes with real stories attached, not the tourist version. Do you know how rare that is in this market right now?" She said, "I need to see them in person, but based on what you are describing, I think we could move all 12 within 2 to 3 weeks, possibly faster." Ellie said, "I need to be honest with you. I have a debt situation that has a specific deadline." Patricia said, "Tell me," she told her. "All of it. The medical bills, the collections attorney, December 1st. Patricia was quiet for 3 full seconds. Then she said, "All right, here is what we are going to do." She talked for another 20 minutes about pricing, about her collector contact list, about a small curated event she could put together on short notice. When they hung up, Ellie sat on the edge of her bed and felt something she had not felt in a long time. She felt like a problem might have a solution. Not a certain solution, not a painless one, but something that was not simply the relentless fact of a number that was too large. She went downstairs and told Cole that she would need to borrow his afternoon to drive the paintings to Bozeman for a gallery appointment. He said, "Fine." Then he said, "Can I come?" She said, "Yes." The gallery was on Mendenhall Street, a converted early 20th century brick building with large north-facing windows and the particular quiet of a serious space. Patricia Holt met them at the door. She was 61, with close-cropped silver hair and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and the permanent slight ink stain on her right index finger that came from years of taking notes in Sharpie at hanging installations. She looked at the paintings one by one, unhurried. Cole stood back by the door and watched. Patricia said nothing for a long time. Then she stopped at the smallest painting, the Flathead Valley Morning. She turned it over and read the back. She was quiet for another moment. She said, "This is the one that anchors the whole show. This goes in the front window." Cole looked at Ellie. Ellie kept her face neutral, but something was happening behind her eyes. Patricia said, "I want 8 more pieces if you can produce them in 3 weeks, different locations, same honesty. I am going to put together an event called Montana Painted True. 20 pieces total. Invite list of serious buyers." She said, "Ellie, I need you to hear me. This work is the real thing. It has always been the real thing. The only person who did not know that was you." On the drive back to the ranch, Cole was quiet for the first 10 minutes. Then he said, "She is right, you know. You paint like you are trying to say something that matters." Ellie kept her eyes on the road. Cole said, "My arm is supposed to come out of this cast in 3 weeks. My father does not know what is going to happen after that. Neither do I. I think sometimes about what it would mean to actually try. Like you try. Like you actually believe the thing you are making has value." Ellie said, "It takes practice. Believing it." Cole said, "How do you start?" She said, "You already have. Every morning you come outside and you put paint on paper and you try to see things honestly. That is the beginning of it." He looked out the window at the November pasture rolling past. He said she mentioned Daniel. She said she missed him. Ellie said, "Everyone who knew him did." He said, "What was he like?" She thought about how to answer that. She said, "He was the kind of person who paid complete attention. Whatever you were saying, whoever you were, he listened as though what you were telling him was the most interesting thing he had heard that day. And he usually meant it." Cole said, "That sounds like a good way to be." She said, "It was." That night, around 11, the barn alarm went off. The sound was a sharp electronic pulse that came through the walls of the house and jolted her awake. She heard Wade's footsteps in the hall, then on the stairs, quick and purposeful. She got up, pulled on her boots and coat, and followed. Outside, the temperature had dropped to 15 below zero. The sky was completely clear, and the stars were merciless in their brightness. The snow compressed sharply under her boots. In the barn, one of the pregnant heifers had gone into early labor. She was down on her side, breathing in the particular labored way of an animal in distress. Wade was already kneeling beside her, and Hector was there, and Darius Webb, one of the younger hands, stood at the edge of the light, holding a towel and a bucket. The calf was arriving breech. Ellie stood inside the door for a moment, taking in the scene. Then she walked forward because standing at the door was not useful. Darius looked at her. She took the towel from him without speaking. She did not know exactly what she was doing, but she knew that when a job needs doing, and you are the person there, you figure it out. 16 years of managing a classroom of 30 teenagers had taught her that if nothing else. The calf came out in a controlled, careful process that Wade directed with his hands and his quiet instructions to Hector. When the calf was finally clear and on the barn floor, it was not breathing. Wade worked on it for 2 full minutes, blowing into the nostrils, rubbing the chest, talking low, just sound, not words. Ellie was on her knees on the other side with the towel, working the calf's body, trying to help the circulation, trying to help the warmth get in. The calf breathed. It was a small, gasping thing at first, not convincing. Then it deepened. The legs started to move. The head came up. 20 minutes later, the calf was standing on 4 legs in the straw, shaking badly, but standing. Ellie looked up and found Wade looking at her. They were both kneeling in the straw on either side of the calf. His hands were stained, and his breath came in white clouds in the frozen barn air. The light from the overhead lamp made everything amber. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not gratitude exactly, though there was that. Not surprise exactly, though there was that too. It was the look of someone who has seen a person be entirely and completely themselves without preparation or performance. They both stood up at the same moment. Her shoulder touched his. Neither of them stepped away. They stood like that, shoulder to shoulder, watching the calf find its legs, find the warmth of its mother's flank. 3 minutes of silence. The kind of silence that is not empty, but full. Hector and Darius busied themselves with equipment on the other side of the barn with the particular tact of working men who know when to make themselves invisible. After a while, Wade said, quietly, "Thank you," she said. "Of course." They walked back to the house through the frozen yard. Inside, the warmth of the kitchen was extraordinary by comparison. Ruth, who had come back that day from her daughters, had left a pot of soup on the stove. Wade ladled 2 bowls, and they sat at the kitchen table. For Thanksgiving 2 days later, Ruth cooked enough for the whole ranch. Hector brought his wife, a small, energetic woman, who immediately took over one corner of the kitchen and would not be removed from it. Darius came, and Pete Collier and Tommy Reyes. Cole came downstairs for the first time to a full table. He sat at the end, nearest the door. Quiet, but he sat. He ate. He answered when someone spoke to him. Ellie watched him from across the table. She watched Wade, who watched Cole without appearing to watch Cole, the way parents do when their children are fragile, and they do not want to spook them with attention. After the meal, when the table was being cleared, and conversations had broken into smaller pieces, Ruth leaned over to Ellie and said quietly, "First time he has sat down with everyone since the accident." She patted Ellie's hand once and went back to the kitchen. Ellie looked at her hand where Ruth had touched it. She thought, this is what a community does. It keeps a place at the table, and it keeps showing up until the person who was missing is back. December arrived with hard weather. The temperature dropped and stayed down. A week of single digits and wind that made everything outside a serious negotiation. The cattle needed extra feed checks. The water lines had to be watched for freezing. The work of the ranch in deep winter was the kind of work that did not stop or adjust for how you were feeling about things. Ellie was producing new paintings as fast as she could honestly manage. She had 7 finished pieces toward the additional 8 Patricia needed. And she was working every afternoon with a focus she had not had in years. She was also in the margins of everything else, beginning to allow herself to believe something she had not been able to believe for a long time, that the work was good, not because she needed to believe it, because she was looking at it clearly and it was true. Cole continued working every morning. He had finished the pencil portrait of his mother and started it again in watercolor. He was getting more precise. He was developing the instinct for when to stop, which is one of the harder things to teach. Ellie had told him once that overworking a painting is always the result of fear, the fear that what you have made is not enough. He had looked at her when she said that, and then looked at his painting, and then put down his brush. One afternoon, Ellie came around the side of the barn on the way back from a painting session in the east pasture and saw Wade standing at the fence watching her from about 200 yards away. He was holding his horse by the reins, and he was not moving. She stopped and looked at him. He did not acknowledge that he had been watching. He turned the horse and rode back toward the barn. That evening, he came into the kitchen where she was making notes in the back of her sketchbook. He poured himself a cup of coffee and stood at the counter for a moment. Then he said, "What do you actually want to do with your work?" "Long term?" She said, "I want to paint. I want to teach when teaching feels like choice and not obligation. I want to make things that are honest." He said, "Not a show in New York or anything like that." She said, "No, I do not have any interest in being a name. I am interested in making things that are true." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "My ex-wife used to tell me I was only really alive when I was working this land." She meant it as a criticism. Ellie said, "Do you think she was right?" He said, "I think she was right that it was true. I think she was wrong that it was a problem." She said, "How long were you married?" He said, 11 years. It was good for most of them. We just wanted different things in the end. She wanted the life we would have had if I had stayed in Seattle. I could not stay in Seattle," Ellie said. "Daniel used to say that some people need to live close to the ground." He meant it literally. He said some people need to be near things that grow. Wade said, "What about you?" She said, "I think that is why I paint outside. I need to see the actual thing. I cannot paint from a photograph. It is not about documentation. It is about the feeling of being in a place." He said, "That makes sense." She said, "It sounds very simple when I say it out loud." He said, "Simple things usually do. That does not make them easy." They were quiet for a while. Through the window, the night was blue-black, and the snow that had been coming down all afternoon had stopped and the stars were starting to show. Wade said, "How close are you to having enough paintings for the gallery show?" She said, "One more. I need one more good piece." He said, "I know a spot. East Ridge at first light. The view down into the valley. Come out with me tomorrow morning, and I will show you." She said, "I will be ready at 6. He nodded and took his coffee and went to his office. She sat at the kitchen table for a while longer with her sketchbook. She was aware of something she had not let herself be aware of for a long time, a kind of warmth that had nothing to do with the wood stove, a kind of attentiveness to the presence of another person that she had been very carefully not attending to. She opened her sketchbook and wrote at the top of a blank page, "Not everything that is growing is a problem." And she closed it. The next morning, they rode out on horseback to the East Ridge before first light. Wade on his gray working horse, Ellie on a steady quarter horse named Ida, who had a very mature opinion about inexperienced riders and adjusted her behavior accordingly. The ride took 40 minutes through the dark and cold, and when they came up over the last rise, the valley opened out below them. She understood immediately why he had brought her here. The view was everything she had been trying to paint since she arrived. The whole ranch was visible, the barn and the house small below, the cattle barely visible in the pre-dawn dark, the creek catching what little light there was, and behind all of it, the mountains beginning to lighten from inside, the sky going from black to a deep underwater blue. She set up her easel in the snow and started mixing paint while it was still dark, working by feel, adjusting as the light came. Wade sat on his horse and watched the valley wake up. She painted for 2 hours. When she stepped back from the canvas, she looked at what she had made, and she knew it was the strongest thing she had produced in years, possibly ever. Wade rode over and looked at it without speaking. After a while, he said, "What are you going to call it?" She said, "I do not know yet. Maybe something will come." He said, "Sometimes the right name comes after. You know what the thing is." She said, "That is true of most things." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "I am glad you came to that market." She said, "I am glad you stopped." They rode back down to the ranch in the thin early light, the horses' breath rising in clouds, the valley quiet and immense around them. The mountains doing their permanent unhurried work above everything. Day 37. That was the number Ellie had in the back of her mind when she woke up that morning. 37 days since she had stood in the snow at the Bozeman Farmers Market with 12 paintings and a $500 problem. The morning started ordinary, cold, clear, coffee on the stove. Then it broke apart in 2 directions at once. She went to the workshop at 9 to find Cole. They had a painting session scheduled, and she was carrying 2 fresh canvases and a palette she had mixed the night before. She pulled open the workshop door. Cole was sitting on the floor with his back against the workbench, a bottle of Jack Daniels beside him, 2/3 empty. He had been there a while. The paintings he had made over the past weeks were on the walls around him, and he was looking at them with the specific expression of someone sitting in judgment over their own life. He looked up when she came in. His eyes were not blank the way they had been in the beginning. They were the opposite. They were full of something he had been carrying alone and had stopped being able to carry. He said, "I need to tell you something." She set the canvases down quietly. He said, "The accident, 5 months ago. It was not caused by a drunk driver. There was no drunk driver. It was me. I was driving drunk." He looked at the wall. He said, "I nearly killed 2 people. A couple who had pulled over to change a tire. I went off the road and I hit the back of their car. They were not seriously injured. They were all right. But I know what I did." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "I have been in this room for 5 months, not because of my arm. The arm is almost healed. I have been here because I do know if I have the right to just go on, like it did not happen. Like I am just a person who gets to keep walking around." Ellie sat down on the floor of the workshop, cross-legged on the cold concrete, 3 feet from him. She did not try to touch his shoulder or say it was going to be okay, or reach for any of the things people reach for when they are frightened by something someone has confessed. She sat with it for a moment. Then she said, "Does your father know?" Cole shook his head. She said, "Cole, you need to tell him." Not today if you cannot, but soon. And here is why. Not because he can fix it, not because he will be able to tell you that you are forgiven, but because you are carrying something that is too heavy to carry alone, and the weight of it is going to crush you. You do not have to let that happen. There is another way through, he said. What is the other way? She said. You stand in front of what you did. You tell the truth about it. And then you figure out what it means to actually make amends. Not punishing yourself in a room. Actual amends. Something that helps someone who might need help. He was quiet a long time, she said. I am not telling you it is easy. I am telling you that keeping it alone in this room is the thing that is not going to work. He nodded once. Small, she said. Your father is a good man. He is not going to love you less for this. He is going to be scared and sad and probably angry for a while. But he is a good man. She left him in the workshop and went to find Wade. She found him coming in from the north pasture, pulling off his work gloves. She told him that Cole needed to talk to him. She said, It is important, she said. He needs you to listen and not respond right away. Give him room to get it all out. Wade looked at her face. He said, What is this about? She said. It is his to tell. Wade went straight to the workshop. She stayed in the kitchen. 90 minutes later, the workshop door opened, and they came out together, Wade's hand on Cole's shoulder in the firm grip of a man who is holding someone in place rather than pushing them away. Cole's face was washed out and raw-looking. Wade's face was tight in a way that meant he was working very hard to keep it contained. They walked past the kitchen toward the house without speaking. Cole went upstairs. Wade stopped in the kitchen doorway. He said, Did you know? Ellie said. I found out this morning. That is why I came to get you. He nodded. He came into the kitchen and stood at the counter. He poured a glass of water and drank most of it. He said, That explains some things. He said it quietly, and she could see him processing the weight of it, 5 months of worry and questions, and his son not coming out of his room, and all of it now rearranging itself into a different shape. A shape with a cause and a possible direction. He said, Thank you. For telling him to talk to me, Ellie said. He did that himself. I just told him the carrying it alone part was the thing that was not going to work. Wade looked at her. Then his phone rang. He looked at the screen and answered it, turning toward the window. His voice shifted into the register he used for business calls, clipped and careful. She went upstairs to give him privacy. Half an hour later, she heard a knock on her door. She opened it. Wade was standing in the hall with a different kind of expression. She had not seen this one before. Something had been shut down in it. He said, Ruth mentioned something to me last week about phone calls you have been making, about deadlines. I looked up the court records. He said it simply, without apology. It is public record. Eleanor Marsh versus Mountain West Medical Collections. $34,200. Ellie said yes, he said. You came here because you were out of options. Not because you wanted to help Cole, she said. I came because I needed to, and I stayed because I genuinely care about Cole and about this place. Both of those things are true at the same time. They are not in conflict, he said. I had started to trust you, she said. You can still trust me. Nothing I have done has been dishonest. His jaw was set. He said, It feels like a mission. She said, I did not lie to you. I did not lie about why I came. You bought my paintings and offered me a job. I took the job because I needed the money. That is honest. And the reason I am still here after 5 weeks is not because I need the money. He looked at her. She said, If you cannot hold both of those things as true simultaneously, I understand. But they are both true. Wade said nothing. He went down the stairs and out the back door into the yard. Ellie closed her door. She sat on the edge of the bed. She thought about Daniel. She thought about what he used to say when she got too sealed inside herself, when the armor she had built became indistinguishable from the person inside it. He would say, Ellie, you are allowed to need people. That is not weakness. That is just being human. She picked up her phone. She typed to Patricia, I have 19 pieces. I am one short. I can finish it by Friday. Can you move the event to the weekend of the 15th? Patricia, done. I have already been making calls. You are going to be okay, Ellie. She put the phone down. She picked up her coat and her supply case. She went outside and up the East Ridge, and she painted the view of the ranch from above, the whole spread of it in the December light, small and real, and entirely itself, and she put into the painting everything she did not know how to say in any other language. Patricia arrived Monday morning with her assistant and a rolling rack of hardware for hanging. She walked through the 20 finished pieces that Ellie had laid out in sequence on the workshop floor, crouching to look at each one, making small notes on the pad she always carried. Cole sat at the workbench and watched. He had been sober for 4 days. He was clear-eyed and pale in the particular way of someone who has recently handed over a very heavy thing. Patricia came to the last painting. The ridge view. She stood in front of it for nearly 3 minutes without speaking. Then she said, This is the one. Cole said, What do you mean? Patricia said, This is the painting that explains all the others. This is the one that tells you who the artist is. Ellie was standing at the back of the workshop with her hands in her coat pockets. Patricia said, Ellie, I need to tell you something. She turned around. Her voice shifted slightly, softened. She said, Do you remember the small painting you left in Daniel's hospital room? The winter window. The bare birch tree? Ellie went still. Patricia said, Daniel had someone come in and photograph it, and he sent me the image 3 months before he died. He asked me to have it properly framed. He asked me to put it in the gallery. She looked at Ellie steadily. She said, It is on the wall on Mendenhall Street, right now. Has been for 2 years. Ellie said nothing. Patricia took out her phone. She turned it so Ellie could see the screen. The small painting, in a clean white frame, hanging on a gallery wall. Real and permanent looking, in a way that it had never seemed when it was just something Ellie had done to pass an hour in a hospital corridor. On the back, in Daniel's handwriting, Patricia had photographed the inscription too. By my wife, Eleanor Marsh. Please sell this to the right person. Someone who understands that beauty exists inside the most painful moments we are given. Ellie looked at the photograph for a long time. Patricia said quietly, I sold it last month. $5,200. The check has been in my desk. Daniel told me to hold it until you were ready, he said. When Ellie is ready to come back to herself, give it to her. He said you would know when that was. Cole had gotten very quiet on his stool at the workbench. Ellie said, How did he know I would need it? Patricia said, He knew you. She stood in the workshop with the smell of paint and cold air and old wood around her, and the 20 paintings arranged on the floor, and the check that had been waiting for her in a drawer for 2 years. And she understood something she had not understood before. Not a lesson, not a realization in the dramatic sense, just a simple recognition. Daniel had seen her more clearly than she had ever seen herself. And the life she was standing inside right now, this cold Montana workshop, this ranch, this collection of people who had ended up in each other's lives by a chain of small accidents. This was the life he would have wanted for her, not instead of the life they had shared. After it, she went to find Wade. He was in the north pasture doing a fence check, which was something he did when he was working through. Something, rather than sitting still with it. She walked out across the field to where he was working. He heard her coming and did not turn around until she was close. She said, "I want to tell you everything." He turned. She told him. All of it in the order it had happened. Daniel's illness, and the debt, and the collectors, and the market, and the $500, and why she had come. She told him about Patricia, and about the painting in the gallery, and about the check in the drawer. She told him about the phone call from Richard Stowe. She told him about the night she had typed the message to Patricia from Cole's laptop, and what that had cost her to do. When she was done, she said, "I was not dishonest with you. I want you to know I understand why it felt that way, and I understand if that changes things." He had listened to all of it without moving, without interrupting. Now, he was quiet for a moment. He said, "I owe you an apology." She said, "You were hurt." "I understand being hurt," he said. "I was hurt in a way that made me say something unkind. Those are separate things. The first one is understandable. The second one, mine's mine to fix," she said. "It was already fixed. You just did it." He looked at her. The winter light was flat and white, and everything about the field around them was cold and clean. He said, "After this is all settled, the gallery, the debt. Do you have plans?" She said, "Not yet." He said, "Cole is going to need to keep working, not as a patient, just as someone learning how to do something. You are good at that, teaching that way." She said, "I know," he said, "and I would like you to stay. Not as an employee. I would like you to stay because you want to." She looked at him. He said, "I understand that is a significant thing to ask." She said, "It is." He said, "I know." She said, "Let me get through the next 2 weeks. Let me get the show done and the debt handled. Then I want to answer that question when I am not standing in the middle of an emergency." He said, "That is fair." He extended his hand. Not as a handshake exactly, just his hand, open in the space between them. She put her hand in his. The Montana painted true opening happened on a Friday evening, 10 days before Christmas. 20 paintings on white walls, correctly lit, small cards beside each one with the location and the 2 or 3 sentences Ellie had written on the backs. Patricia had called 70 people personally. 53 showed up. By 9 o'clock, 17 paintings had sold. Total, $28,400. Added to the $3,200 from Daniel's painting, she had $31,600. She was $2,600 short. Cole arrived late, having driven himself to Bozeman for the first time since the accident. He stood in the gallery for an hour, looking at the paintings he had watched being made. He talked to 2 people who asked him about them because he had been there and he could answer honestly. Before the event ended, he found Ellie near the back of the room. He held out an envelope. He said, "I'd finished the portrait of my mother. Patricia sold it this week." He said, "It is $900. He said, "That is not mine to keep." She took the envelope. She said, "Cole?" He said, "I know what you are going to say," she said. "What am I going to say?" He said, "You are going to say I do not have to do this." She said, "I was going to say thank you." He nodded once. He looked like someone who had just put down something heavy and found, to his surprise, that the world did not end when he let it go. $32,500. Enough for the debt and the legal fees, and $137 left over. She called Richard Stowe on Monday morning and arranged the payment. His voice was exactly as flat and professional as it had always been. He said the account would be marked settled within 10 business days. She said, "Thank you," he said. "You're welcome." She hung up and stood in the kitchen in the morning light and felt the particular sensation of a weight she had been carrying so long. She had stopped feeling it lifting away. Ruth came in from the back door and looked at her face. Ruth said, "Done?" Ellie said, "Done." Ruth said, "Good." She set a cup of coffee on the counter. She said, "Now maybe you can stop doing math in the back of your head every time someone talks to you." Ellie laughed. It surprised her, the laugh. It was real and sudden, and it lasted longer than she expected. The summer came in the way Montana summer does, not gradually, but all at once, as though the land had been holding its breath since November, and finally let it go. The grass went from brown to green in the space of 2 weeks. The Bridger Range lost its snow to the tree line, and then below it as June ran through. The air smelled of sage and warming soil, and the particular sweetness of a place that had been cold for a very long time, and was now allowing itself to be warm. Ellie had been at the ranch for 8 months. Her studio was the converted equipment shed on the north side of the barn. Wade had done most of the conversion himself, over 3 weekends in February and March, putting in large north-facing windows for proper light, insulating the walls against the cold, laying a concrete floor with radiant heating, because she had mentioned once, not as a complaint, just as a fact, that her hands got stiff when she painted in cold rooms. She had never asked him to do any of it. She had come out one Saturday in February to find him on a ladder with a pry bar, taking out the old boards to frame the window opening. She had stood in the yard watching him for a moment. He had looked down and said, "I figured the light from the north would work better for what you do," she said. "It will." "Yes," he said. "I found a door at the salvage yard in Livingston. Old pine, still has the original hardware. Thought it might suit the space," she said. "It sounds perfect," he said. "It will be done by end of March." It was done by end of March. One evening in late June, they were sitting on the porch after dinner, the valley going gold in the long summer light. Cole was in Bozeman. He had started a 2-year program in fine arts at Montana State in the spring, something he had announced at dinner one evening in March, with the careful manner of who has thought about a decision long enough that it has become solid, and they are simply reporting it. Wade had said, "Good." Cole had said, "I am also going to start talking to people." He meant the support group that Ellie had mentioned, a program for people who had caused accidents while impaired, not the victim side, but the other side, the harder side. Wade had looked at his plate for a moment. Then he had said, "I think that is the right thing. I will come with you to the first meeting if you want." Cole had said, "You do not have to." Wade had said, "I know I do not have to." Cole had said, "Okay, yes, come." Now, on the porch in June, Ellie watched the light on the mountains, and Wade sat beside her in the other chair with his coffee and the specific comfortable quietness of a person who has arrived somewhere they were supposed to be. He said, "I want to ask you something." She said, "All right." He said, "I have been thinking about how to say this for about 2 months." She said, "That sounds like you." He almost smiled. He said, "Do you want to be here?" She said, "I am here," he said. "I know you are here. I am asking if you want to be here. Not because you needed somewhere to land. Not because the situation worked out. Because you want this to be your life." She looked at the mountains for a moment. She said, "Wade, I drove 4 hours north with 12 paintings in the back of my car and $200 in my bank account because I was out of road. That is how I got here. That is true, she said, and this is also true. I have not wanted to leave since about the third week. Not because I was dependent on the arrangement. Because when I wake up in the morning and I know I am going to go outside, Dad, and paint what is actually there, and I know I am going to come in and find you in the kitchen, and I know Cole is going to call on Sunday afternoon, I feel like myself, not the self I was performing. The actual one, he was quiet. She said, "Do you want me to be here?" He said, "I would not be asking if I did not." She said, "Then we are." Agreed. He reached over and took her hand. They sat on the porch with the summer coming off the mountains in long, flat waves of gold and green, and they did not say anything else for a while, because nothing else needed saying. They were married on a Saturday in late July on the East Ridge, the spot where she had painted the valley at Hat. First light on the morning wade had brought her there. The spot that had produced the painting Patricia had put in the front window of the gallery. Ellie wore a blue dress, not a wedding gown, just a dress she liked. Cole stood beside Wade. Ruth stood beside Ellie. Hector and his wife and Darius and Pete and Tommy and his family stood in a loose group on the grass, and Patricia drove up from Bozeman with a bottle of good wine. The minister was a man from the small church in town who had known Wade's father and said so at the beginning of the ceremony, which Wade seemed to appreciate. On the table set up under the aspen trees, between the food that Ruth and Hector's wife had made together in the kitchen that morning, there were two photographs. One was of Daniel, laughing at the Chicago gallery opening. One was of Wade's parents, standing in the yard of this ranch on what appeared to be a summer day many years ago, the barn behind them, the same barn that was still there now. Nobody arranged those photographs. They were simply there. 2 years later, October. The aspens on the ridge had gone gold, and the mornings had frost in them, and the sky was the specific high blue that only happens in fall at altitude. Ellie was in her studio by 7:30 most mornings. The show she was preparing for was her first true solo exhibition, 28 pieces at the largest gallery in Bozeman, running through December. Patricia had titled it The People Who Stay, all portraits. Ruth at the kitchen stove, the particular angle of her shoulders when she was concentrating. Hector on horseback at dawn, his profile against the early sky. Cole at his easel in his apartment in Bozeman, the light from the studio window on his face. And one of Wade, standing at the fence line in the early morning, looking out over the pasture, his back to the viewer, the mountains ahead of him, and something in the set of his shoulders that said, "This is my place, and I know it." She taught a painting class on Saturday mornings at the Bozeman Public Library, free, open to adults, any level. The 12 people who came each week were retired ranchers and young teachers, and a woman of 72 who had always wanted to try and had never gotten around to it. Ellie taught them the way she had been trying to learn to teach her whole life. Not how to make paintings look like paintings, but how to actually look at what was in front of them. Cole called every Sunday afternoon. He was in his second year at Montana State. 3 of his paintings had sold through Patricia's gallery at prices that would have surprised him if he had let himself be surprised. He had donated the money to the rehabilitation center outside Bozeman that ran the program he participated in. He told Ellie once, on the phone, that speaking in the group was the hardest thing he had done. Harder than the first painting session in the yard, Harder than the conversation with his father. He said, "But you were right. The carrying it alone part was the thing that was not going to work." She said, "I know. I had to learn that too." He said, "How did you learn it?" She said, "A man at a farmer's market bought 12 paintings I could not sell and offered me a job I had no reason to trust, and it turned out to be the best decision I ever made to follow him home." Cole laughed. He said, "That is a very good story," she said. "I know." In late October, Patricia called on a Tuesday morning about a piece that had come in for consignment, a question about pricing. They talked for 20 minutes, and at the end, Patricia said, "I need you to know something." Ellie said, "What?" Patricia said, "When Daniel asked me to frame that hospital painting and put it on the wall, I asked him why. I asked him why he did not just give it to you directly," he said, "because Ellie needs to find her way back to it herself. If I give it to her now, when she is raw, she will not be able to receive it. But if it is waiting for her when she is ready, she will understand what it means." Ellie was quiet. Patricia said, "I just wanted you to know that he understood you very well," she said. "I know. I think I always knew." She hung up and stood in the studio for a moment. The north light was coming in through the big windows and falling in long planes across the canvas she had been working on. Outside, through the window, she could see the yard and the barn and the pasture running out toward the mountains. She picked up her brush. The last painting she completed before the December opening was a piece she had been thinking about since November of the year she arrived. She had sketched it a dozen times. She had never been able to get it right until now. It was a view from the street, a silver Honda Civic parked outside a ranch gate in the snow. A woman standing beside the car, looking up at the house at the end of the lane, her back to the viewer, her spine straight, her coat inadequate for the weather, her hands at her sides. Not a dramatic image, not a painting that announced itself. A painting of a particular moment. The moment before you know what is coming. The moment of standing still in the cold and not yet understanding that the cold is not the story. That the story is the gate in front of you and the light in the window of the house at the end of the lane and the fact that you are about to walk toward it. Patricia called when she saw the photograph Ellie sent. She said, "What are you calling it?" Ellie said. She did not know she was walking toward her life. Patricia said, "Perfect. That goes in the front window." On a Friday evening in November, with the first serious snow of the season coming down outside and the wood stove doing its work in the corner of the living room, Ellie sat at the kitchen table, finishing a letter to the 14 people who had been in her Saturday morning class since September. She wanted to tell them about the show and invite them to the opening. She was taking her time with the letter because she wanted to get it right. Wade came in from the evening pasture check, pulled off his boots at the door, and went to the stove to check the soup Ruth had left. He ladled a bowl and sat down across from her. He said, "What are you writing?" She said, "A letter to my students." He looked at what she had written. He read a few lines. He said, "This is good." She said, "I am trying to tell them something without making it sound like advice." He said, "What are you trying to tell them?" She said, "That it is worth it. To keep making things, to keep trying to see honestly, even when nobody is looking, even when the market is slow, even when the light is wrong and the day is cold, and you have been standing in one place for 3 hours, and you are not sure you are getting anywhere." He said, "That does not sound like advice. That sounds like something you know." She said, "I do know it. I have known it for a long time. I just forgot for a while." He got up to refill his coffee. He came back and sat down and looked at her. He said, "Ellie." She said, "Yes." He said, "I am glad you were at that market." She said, "You have told me that before." He said, "I know. I am just saying it again." She looked at him. The wood stove popped. The snow was coming down outside the kitchen window, soft and steady, the kind of snow that covers everything in the night and makes the world look clean in the morning. She said, "I am glad you stopped." He nodded once. She went back to her letter. He drank his coffee. The snow kept falling. Outside, Callaway Ranch settled into itself for the night, the way old things do. Without ceremony, without announcement, simply present, simply there, simply itself, in the dark and the cold and the quiet that is not empty but full. Ruth was the last one up that night. She turned off the kitchen light at 10:30 and stood for a moment in the dark at the window. The snow had covered the yard and the fence and the roof of the barn. The mountains were invisible in the dark, but she knew they were there. She said softly, to no one in particular, or perhaps to someone specific who was simply not visible in the ordinary way. "Daniel, honey, she is going to be just fine." She went to bed. The fire in the wood stove banked itself down to a low, steady heat. The ranch held everything inside it. The paintings on the studio wall, the sketchbooks on Cole's shelf in Bozeman, the check stubs filed in Ruth's kitchen drawer, the blue velvet folded in a box at the top of Ellie's closet. The memory of a morning market and a $500 bill and 12 paintings in the cold and one man who looked at what he saw and simply acted because he had always believed that action was the most honest form of language available to him. Outside, Montana went on in its enormous and indifferent and quietly magnificent way. And inside the house, on the ridge above the valley, two people who had found each other by accident and stayed together by choice slept well in the particular way of people who have arrived somewhere true and know it. This work is a creation of the author's imagination, designed to entertain and provoke thought. Any resemblance to real persons, places, or events is purely accidental. The author assumes no responsibility for interpretations that connect fictional elements to real-world entities.
Before we close this story, I want to sit with you for just a moment. Because this is not really a story about a cowboy buying paintings, and it is not really a story about a woman in debt. Those are the circumstances. The story itself is about something much older and much more quietly urgent than any of that. This is a story about what happens when we stop letting people see us. Ellie Marsh spent 3 years after her husband died being completely fine, completely capable, completely in control. She smiled when people asked how she was doing. She handled every problem alone. She turned down every open hand, and slowly, without meaning to, she had built a wall so well constructed that even she could no longer find the door. Most of us know that wall. We built ours too, out of pride, or grief, or the simple exhaustion of having been strong for so long that we forgot strength was supposed to be a tool, not an identity. The first lesson this story offers is this: asking for help is not the same as giving up. It is, in fact, the beginning of something. It is the moment you say to another person, "I trust you with where I actually am." And that trust, offered honestly, is where every real relationship begins. The second lesson lives inside Wade Calloway, a man who barely said 100 words in the first chapter. Wade did not rescue Ellie with a speech or a grand gesture. He bought her paintings. He offered her honest work at fair pay. He treated her as a person with value at the exact moment she had stopped treating herself that way. He did not pity her. He saw her. There is an enormous difference between those two things. Pity looks down. Seeing looks across. And what this world needs more of, right now, today, is people willing to look across. The third lesson belongs to coal, because coal reminds us that the heaviest thing a person can carry is a secret that needs to be spoken, not to be forgiven, not to be excused, but because truth, spoken out loud, is the only material strong enough to build a real future from. And the final lesson is the one Daniel left behind in a small painting on a hospital wall. He saw his wife more clearly than she saw herself. He prepared for the moment she would be ready, and he trusted that moment would come. It did. It always does. The question this story leaves us with is not whether we are broken. Most of us are in some way, in some corner we do not talk about. The question is whether we are willing to walk through the gate anyway. Whether we are willing to stand in the cold, hold our work up to the light, and let someone stop and look. Because sometimes the most important thing that will ever happen to you begins with a stranger who simply chooses to stop.